The workers had barely dug half a meter when the shovel struck something hard. At first, they thought it was stone, until the curve of a human rib emerged from the soil. A Casio calculator watch, a torn school tie, bones scarred by blades, and a shallow grave hidden just steps from the home of Argentina's most famous rock star, Gustavo Cerati. Before we dive in, if you are new to this channel, don't forget to hit the subscribe button, like this video, and comment where you are watching from. Diego Fernandez Lima was just 16 years old when he vanished in 1984. His last words to his mother were, "I'm going to a friend's house and then to school." He never returned. For decades, his family searched in vain, until chance uncovered the grave, and suspicion pointed toward an old classmate, Christian Graf. But what really happened to Diego that day? And why was his body left in such a shallow grave next door? The afternoon sun was bright over Buenos Aires on July 26, 1984. It was just after 2 o'clock when 16-year-old Diego Fernandez Lima stepped out of his family's modest home. He wore his school uniform, the tie slightly loosened as if he'd been in a rush. Before leaving, he turned to his mother. "I'm going to a friend's house and then to school," he said casually, as if it were the most ordinary thing in the world. His younger brother Javier, only a boy at the time, would later remember that moment with haunting clarity, the way Diego adjusted his watch, the playful grin he gave before disappearing out the door. No one could have imagined that it would be the last time they ever saw him alive. That single goodbye would echo through the lives of his family for decades. But at the time, it was just another weekday. Diego was the kind of boy who rarely gave his family reason to worry. He loved soccer, he loved motorcycles, and like any teenager, he had his circle of friends, dreams, and plans for the future. His mother thought nothing of it. After all, he was just 16, full of life, and his path seemed unwritten. Hours passed. Evening fell. Dinner was set on the table, but Diego's chair sat empty. At first, his family brushed it off. Maybe he was still with friends, or maybe he stayed late at school. By 10 o'clock, though, unease crept in. His younger brother kept peeking through the window, waiting for the familiar sound of footsteps outside. His mother began pacing. Midnight came, and the silence in the house grew unbearable. Where was Diego? The family tried calling friends, but none had seen him since earlier that day. His teachers hadn't heard from him either. By dawn, panic set in. Diego had vanished. What began as a late return home quickly spiraled into a nightmare that would stretch across decades. The morning after Diego disappeared, his mother clutched the phone in her hand, calling every relative she could think of. Maybe he had gone to stay with cousins, maybe he had spent the night at a friend's house. But every answer was the same: "No, we haven't seen him." By the second day, fear had replaced hope. His father, a hard-working man who adored his son, refused to sit idly by. He scoured the streets of Buenos Aires, walking through neighborhoods, knocking on doors, calling Diego's name in places where his boy might have wandered. Friends joined the search. Flyers were written out by hand, though few people paid attention. Finally, after 48 agonizing hours, the family went to the police. Inside the station, a tired officer barely looked up from his desk. The words "My son is missing" seemed to bounce off the walls. The officer smirked and gave the kind of answer countless desperate families have heard before. "He's probably run away with a girlfriend. Boys his age always come back." The dismissal felt like a slap in the face. Diego's mother insisted. Her son was not a runaway. He was a responsible boy, devoted to his studies and his family. He wasn't the type to disappear without a word. But the police waved them off. Without evidence of foul play, there would be no official search. The family was left on their own. Diego's father refused to stop. Every rumor, every whisper he followed. Some said they saw a boy matching Diego's description near the bus station. Others claimed he was seen riding a motorcycle with a friend. None of the tips led anywhere. His father pushed himself to exhaustion, consumed by the quest to bring his son home. Tragically, that quest ended in heartbreak. In the middle of his relentless search, he suffered a fatal accident. One desperate mission to find his boy had cost him his life. The household fell into grief, but Diego's mother refused to give in. She held on to hope with a grip as unyielding as iron. In the years that followed, she preserved her missing son's bedroom exactly as he had left it. Clothes folded neatly, books stacked on the shelf, posters on the wall. It became a shrine to a boy frozen in time. She refused to change the family's phone number. What if Diego tried to call home? She couldn't risk it. Decades passed, and the phone never rang with his voice. Meanwhile, Javier, the younger brother who had watched Diego walk out that summer afternoon, grew up under the shadow of unanswered questions. He replayed that moment in his head over and over again, wondering if there was something he could have done, some word he could have spoken to change the outcome. The silence around Diego's disappearance stretched into years, then decades. The police never reopened the file. The family never stopped hurting. And then, just when time had nearly buried the memory of Diego alongside the forgotten case files, fate intervened. It was May 2025, more than 40 years later, when workers digging a shallow trench along a dividing wall unearthed something chilling. Bones, tangled with scraps of fabric, lying in a shallow grave only half a meter deep. It was pure chance. But chance has a way of unearthing secrets long thought buried. What the workers found that day would unravel a mystery frozen since 1984. A mystery that would lead back to the boy who said goodbye and never came home. And the shocking truth of who might have killed him was hidden right next door. Grief does strange things to a family. For some, it breaks them into silence. For others, it ignites a fire that refuses to burn out. For Diego Fernandez Lima's father, it was the latter. When the police brushed aside his son's disappearance, he made a vow. If no one else would look for Diego, he would. He quit sleeping properly. Nights were spent walking the streets, scanning faces under the yellow glow of street lamps, asking strangers if they'd seen a boy with dark hair, 1.72 meters tall, wearing a school uniform the day he vanished. By day he haunted bus stations, train platforms, and soccer fields. He would pin flyers to lampposts only to find them torn down days later, trampled into the gutter. Every rumor, no matter how faint, became a lead. Someone thought they saw a boy matching Diego's description near Constitution Station. Another swore they saw him riding on the back of a motorcycle. Each time, Diego's father dropped everything and chased the possibility, even if it meant walking miles, even if it meant returning empty-handed and exhausted. His wife begged him to rest. She worried about his health, about the toll this endless chase was taking on him. But how could a father rest when his son was out there, maybe scared, maybe hurt, maybe waiting for him to come? Week after week, the obsession consumed him. He became gaunt, his eyes hollow, his hands trembling from fatigue and grief. Friends whispered that he was killing himself slowly, but he wouldn't stop. And then the prophecy became true. In the midst of one of his relentless searches, rushing to follow a lead about a boy spotted outside Buenos Aires, Diego's father was involved in a sudden, fatal accident. The details are sparse, but the outcome was merciless. He never came home. The man who had fought so desperately to find his son became another casualty of Diego's disappearance. The family was struck by a double tragedy. One son gone, presumed missing. One father gone, buried in the ground. Diego's mother now carried the weight of both losses. She had to bury her husband while still living with the gnawing hope that her son might walk back through the door at any moment. And as if fate hadn't already been cruel enough, she was left to raise her younger son Javier in a house haunted by absence. But she was not ready to give up. If her husband's fight had ended, hers was only beginning. She would become the keeper of Diego's memory, the guardian of a hope that refused to die, even if the years stretched on endlessly. If you step into Diego's childhood home today, you would swear he had just left moments ago. His room is a time capsule. His bed still neatly made. Schoolbooks stacked on the desk. Soccer memorabilia clinging to the walls. It is a space untouched by the decades that have passed since July 26, 1984. For his mother, preserving that room became a ritual of survival. Every day she would dust his shelves, straighten his belongings, and smooth out the wrinkles in his bed sheets as though preparing for his return. It was her way of keeping him alive, not in body but in presence. She refused to change the family's phone number, clinging to the idea that Diego might one day call home. Whenever the phone rang, her heart would leap. Sometimes, late at night, when the house was silent, she would sit by the phone waiting for it to break the silence. Waiting for her son's voice to bridge the decades. Neighbors pitied her. Some whispered that she was trapped in denial, that she needed to move on. But how does a mother move on when she never had a body to bury? When she never had an answer? Hope can be crueler than grief. It keeps you waiting in a prison of maybes. Javier, Diego's younger brother, grew up in that atmosphere of suspended time. He watched his mother polish a life that had vanished, clinging to the scent of a boy who had been 16 forever. For Javier, the moment his brother stepped out that door never stopped replaying. He had been the last to see Diego alive. That guilt lingered into adulthood, an invisible weight pressing down on his shoulders. Years turned into decades. The 1990s came and went. The new millennium arrived. Entire generations grew up never knowing the boy whose room had become a shrine. But inside that house, the silence only deepened. Diego's mother aged. Her hair turned white. Her hands trembled as she folded his clothes, yet she still kept them washed and pressed. The Fernandez Lima home became a monument of waiting. A place where time had stopped, where a mother refused to let go, and where a younger brother lived in the shadow of a sibling frozen in eternal absence. And then, just as the story seemed doomed to remain unsolved, fate intervened. May 2025. On a neighboring property, construction workers dug into the earth to repair a dividing wall. Their shovels struck something unusual, something solid. At first they thought it was debris. But then, half a meter below the surface, they unearthed bones. Human bones. Tangled with scraps of fabric. A watch. A tie. The discovery would not only shatter 4 decades of silence, it would drag the Fernandez Lima family into the spotlight once more, and force them to relive a nightmare they had never escaped. And when the truth came out, it would reveal that the answers they had searched for all along were hidden frighteningly close to home. The morning was ordinary. Workers filed into a property in Buenos Aires, their tools clattering against concrete as they prepared to repair an aging dividing wall. It was early May 2025, the kind of crisp day when no one expects history to come clawing out of the ground. Their job was simple: break down the weak portions of the wall, dig a trench, lay a new foundation. A day's work. Nothing more. But as one worker thrust his shovel into the dry soil, the blade caught on something solid. He expected rock, maybe brick. Instead, he uncovered something curved, fragile, too delicate to be construction debris. The men leaned closer. Dust and dirt fell away, revealing a pale arc. At first, someone joked that it looked like a bone. A dog's, maybe. But as more soil was cleared, the bone revealed joints, structure. It was unmistakable. A human rib. The worksite fell silent. By the time they uncovered more fragments, a femur, then the distinct curve of a skull, their shock turned to dread. Buried less than half a meter beneath the earth, in a shallow, almost careless grave, lay a human skeleton. It wasn't just bones. Tangled in the soil were remnants of clothing. A faded scrap of fabric, once dark but now bleached by decades underground. A strip of material that looked like the remains of a tie. And then something that sent chills through everyone present. A wristwatch. Not just any watch. A Casio digital calculator watch, the kind that was a status symbol for students in the 1980s. Its surface was scratched, its band brittle, but it was still recognizable. A relic of another time. The workers dropped their tools. Some crossed themselves. Others whispered nervously about what they had unearthed. Should they stop? Should they call the police? Or would this discovery bring trouble that no one wanted? What made the discovery even more chilling was where it happened. The house belonged to the Graf family, long-standing residents of the neighborhood. But just over the dividing wall, barely meters away, stood a home that once belonged to Argentine rock legend Gustavo Cerati, the iconic frontman of Soda Stereo. The media would seize on that fact almost instantly, pushing the story into headlines: remains found beside Cerati's former home. But for the family of Diego Fernandez Lima, who had waited 41 years for answers, the location didn't matter. What mattered was that someone had finally found him. Police were called to the scene. Soon, the quiet residential streets swarmed with investigators, forensic teams, and journalists. Yellow tape cordoned off the property as cameras clicked and neighbors peered through half-closed curtains. Some whispered that the house had always carried shadows. Others claimed they had heard rumors of something buried there long ago, but had dismissed them as neighborhood gossip. The shallow grave itself spoke volumes. The skeleton wasn't buried with care or dignity. It was dumped. Hastily. Half a meter deep, as if the killer never expected the body to be found. And yet, time has a way of forcing secrets into the light. As forensic experts worked, they collected fragments of clothing and bone, carefully bagging every piece. The Casio watch, the tie, the scraps of fabric, all were treated as potential keys to unlocking the victim's identity. But what haunted them most were the marks on the bones themselves. Cuts, grooves. Blades had pierced this body. Whispers spread like wildfire. Whose body was this? How long had it been there? And more chilling still, who had placed it there? One neighbor mentioned the Graf family. Christian Graf had grown up in that very house. He had been a classmate of a boy who went missing decades earlier. Could it be him? Another swore they remembered gossip from the 1980s about a teenager who never came home. The speculation was instant, but the truth would take longer. The bones were collected. Forensic experts began their analysis. The media began digging. And as word spread, one phone call would change everything. The nephew of a missing boy contacted authorities. His uncle had disappeared in 1984. His name was Diego Fernandez Lima. He had been 16. He had left home one afternoon and never returned. Could these bones belong to him? A DNA test would answer that. But already the clues seemed to point in one direction. A Casio calculator watch. A school tie. Clothes from the 1980s. A grave just meters from the home of a former classmate. After 4 decades of silence, the earth itself had spoken. And the truth it whispered was chilling. At the Argentine forensic anthropology team's laboratory, the bones were laid out piece by piece. A puzzle of tragedy waiting to be solved. Each fragment told part of a story that had been buried in silence for over 40 years. The skeleton was fragile but surprisingly complete. Forensic anthropologists began their meticulous work, cleaning each bone, cataloging them, and searching for the hidden messages left behind by time and violence. The first question: who was he? The skeletal structure revealed a young male between 16 and 19 years old. Height: approximately 1.72 meters. That detail alone narrowed the possibilities. This wasn't an adult. This was someone who had barely crossed into manhood. Next came the wounds. On the left side of the rib cage at the level of the 4th rib, there was a deep cut. Not the kind made by an accident but by a blade. A knife or some other sharp object had pierced through bone. Forensic experts recognized it immediately. This was the kind of injury that could have collapsed a lung, ending life quickly. But that wasn't the only mark. On the hip bones and upper limbs they found more cuts. Different in angle, different in depth, as though inflicted with another blade. These weren't single strikes in a fight. These were attempts to cut, to separate. In other words, dismemberment. The theory was chilling. Whoever killed this boy may have tried to dismember his body, perhaps to dispose of it more easily. But for whatever reason, panic, inexperience, fear, they stopped. Instead, they buried him hastily, shallow in the ground. The personal effects told the rest of the story. A Casio calculator watch. A tie from a school uniform. Fragments of clothing from brands popular in Argentina during the 1980s. These weren't random items. They belonged to a teenager. As investigators built the profile, a call came in. The family of a long-missing boy believed this might be him. DNA samples were taken from his 87-year-old mother. Days later, the results came back. The match was absolute. The bones belonged to Diego Fernandez Lima, the 16-year-old who vanished on July 26, 1984. For his mother, the confirmation was both a relief and a devastation. Relief because after 41 years of uncertainty, she finally had an answer. Devastation because the answer was worse than any hope she had clung to. Diego hadn't run away. He hadn't vanished into a new life. He had been murdered, his body hidden just meters from the world that went on without him. Investigators now faced a bigger question: who killed him and why? The location of the grave pointed toward one family, the Grafs. The bones had been buried along the edge of their property. And suspicion quickly fell on Christine Graf, Diego's former classmate. They weren't close friends, but they had shared a hobby: motorcycles. Christine often repaired them. Diego loved riding them. It wasn't hard to imagine Diego stopping by the Graf house that afternoon. But what happened next? When workers uncovered the bones, Christian himself appeared at the site. His reaction was odd. He didn't express shock or sorrow. Instead, he offered strange theories. First, he said the remains might belong to a priest, since a church had once stood nearby. Then he suggested they might be from a stable worker. Later still, he claimed they could have been dumped there. 3 explanations. None convincing. And when a journalist confronted him directly, asking if he had anything to do with Diego's death, Christian froze, flinched, and slammed his door shut without a denial. The forensic evidence was clear: Diego had been murdered. But the legal path was murky. Argentina's laws meant the crime was statute barred. Prosecutors could not press charges for a homicide more than 20 years old if no one had been formally accused during that time. In other words, even if Christine Graf had killed Diego, he might never face justice. For Diego's family, the pain deepened. They had answers at last, but no accountability. The bones laid bare the violence of that day in 1984. The knife wound, the failed dismemberment, the shallow grave. It was a story written into bone, silent for decades until science gave it voice. But the most haunting question of all still lingered. What? The lab was silent. On one side of the table lay a set of bones, carefully arranged by the forensic anthropology team. Each rib, each fragment of pelvis, each brittle piece of vertebra catalogued, labeled, and preserved. On the other side, a vial no bigger than a fingertip. Inside that vial was blood. Blood drawn from an 87-year-old woman whose hands shook as she rolled up her sleeve. Her name, Donna Elena Lima. The mother of the boy who had vanished without a trace 41 years earlier. The scientists prepared the test with clinical precision, but there was nothing clinical about the weight in the room. Everyone knew what was at stake. Forensic science had come a long way since 1984. What had once been impossible, matching a son's skeleton to his mother's DNA, was now routine. But routine didn't mean emotionless. Because when you work with remains, you know the truth you reveal has the power to shatter or to heal. Sometimes both at once. The lab machines hummed to life. DNA extracted from bone marrow was compared against the fresh blood sample. The process wasn't quick, it would take days. But when the results finally came in, there was no ambiguity. The genetic match was conclusive. The skeletal remains belonged to Diego Fernandez Lima, the boy who left home one July afternoon in 1984, telling his mother he'd be back after school. The boy who never returned. Diego was home again, but not in the way anyone had prayed for. When investigators delivered the news to Elena, she didn't speak at first. She sat in her small living room, surrounded by photographs that had not moved in 4 decades. The couch was the same one Diego had sprawled on as a teenager. His room, down the hall, remained untouched. His textbook still sat on the desk, his jacket still hung in the closet. She had kept it all. Year after year, while neighbors moved away, while time painted her hair white and bent her frame, Elena refused to change a thing. She even kept the same phone number, in case Diego ever called. And now the call had come. But it wasn't Diego. It was the police. And they weren't telling her he was coming home. They were telling her that the bones buried in a shallow grave belonged to her son. Witnesses who were present when she heard the news say she let out a sound that no one could describe. A sound somewhere between a cry and a gasp, the kind of sound that tears through the air because it has been trapped inside for too long. For 41 years she had wondered. Did he run away? Did he get into trouble? Did someone take him? Now she knew. He had been murdered. Buried like trash. Forgotten by the world. Elena's grief was not quiet. But it wasn't rage either. It was a tidal wave of memory. She whispered Diego's name over and over, clutching a framed photo of him at 16. His soccer uniform, his smile, his future frozen in the moment before it was stolen. Her younger son, Javier, who had been a child when Diego vanished, wept too. He had grown up in the shadow of an empty chair at the dinner table, a mother who checked the door every night, a father who drove himself to exhaustion searching for answers until his fatal accident. The confirmation of Diego's identity didn't just answer questions. It reopened wounds. For the public, the DNA result was a headline. Remains identified as teen missing since 1984. For journalists, it was a tragic story, tied by coincidence to the rock legend Gustavo Cerati's former home. For prosecutors, it was a piece of evidence. But for Elena, it was the end of hope. Every night for decades she had left a light on in Diego's room. Every birthday she had baked a small cake. Every New Year she had whispered the same prayer, maybe this will be the year he comes back. Now she knew he was never coming back. And yet, something inside her refused to let go. She demanded to see the box of bones herself. To touch the watch. To hold the tie. These weren't just objects. They were Diego's last whispers, the proof that he had existed, the proof that she hadn't imagined him. When they placed the Casio calculator watch in her trembling hand, she broke down completely. She remembered how proud Diego had been of that watch, how he'd shown it off to his friends, how he'd worn it even when it clashed with his uniform. This was my boy's, she whispered, tears running down her face. This was his. The DNA test had confirmed what science demanded. But for Elena, it was this watch, this tangible piece of Diego's life, that confirmed the truth in her heart. Her son had been found, but not saved. The media swarmed. Reporters camped outside her modest home. Cameras shoved in her face asking, "Do you feel justice has been served? Do you blame Christine Graff? What do you want now?" She answered none of them. She closed the door. Because for her, justice was already denied. Argentina's statute of limitations meant no one might ever be punished for Diego's murder. Think about that. 41 years of waiting. 41 years of silence. And when the truth finally clawed its way out of the dirt, the law itself stood in the way of justice. What does a mother do with that kind of knowledge? She sat in Diego's room. She touched his desk. She picked up the soccer ball he had left behind. She whispered into the empty air, "I found you, Diego. I found you." I never stopped looking. Outside, the world debated suspects, motives, evidence. Journalists speculated. Prosecutors wrestled with technicalities. But inside that quiet house, one truth mattered above all. Diego was gone. And his mother's lifelong vigil had ended not in reunion, but in heartbreak. The DNA revelation did more than close a case file. It reopened an old wound for an entire country. People who had been teenagers in the 1980s remembered the fear of that time, the disappearances, the silences. They saw in Elena's face the echo of countless mothers who had waited for children that never came home. And still, one question burned brighter than ever. If the DNA confirmed Diego's death, who would answer for his murder? The match had given the Fernandez Lima family the truth. But truth without justice is just another kind of torment. And as suspicion mounted against Diego's former classmate, Christian Graf, the story took a darker turn. Because if the killer was still alive, still walking free, then Diego's mother wasn't just a grieving parent. She was a living reminder that even when science solves the mystery, the law doesn't always deliver justice. The DNA had spoken. But the grave still whispered. It started with whispers. When the skeletal remains of 16-year-old Diego Fernandez Lima were unearthed just half a meter beneath the soil of a neighborhood property in May 2025, neighbors exchanged glances. Who could bury a boy there, and live for decades with the secret just across the wall? The name that surfaced was one that everyone knew. A man who had grown up in that very house, just meters from where Diego's body was found. His name was Christian Graf. And here's where the story takes a chilling turn. At first glance, Christian was nothing remarkable. A mechanic, a husband, a father of 4. The kind of neighbor you nod to on the street without giving it much thought. His mother still lived in the same Graf family home where Diego's grave had been dug, while Christian himself had moved elsewhere years ago. But when workers stumbled on the bones, Christian suddenly reappeared at the scene. And what he did there made people uneasy. He approached the construction crew trying to explain away the discovery. Not once, not twice, but 3 different times. First, he suggested the remains might belong to a priest from decades earlier, because a church had supposedly once stood nearby. When that theory fell apart, he floated another. Maybe they were tied to an old stable. And then, bizarrely, he speculated that the bones had simply been dumped there long ago. 3 explanations. 3 attempts to deflect suspicion. But why would an innocent man be so invested in rationalizing a set of bones that weren't even on his property anymore? The workers thought it was odd. Investigators thought it was suspicious. And when word spread, neighbors began to remember details from long ago, small things that suddenly seemed far more sinister in hindsight. Back in the 1980s, Christian and Diego hadn't been close friends, but they had crossed paths often. Both were teenagers, both were fascinated by motorcycles. Diego had his beloved bike. Christian was known for repairing them. It wasn't strange for Diego to stop by the Graf house, even if just to talk shop or fix something on his bike. That simple hobby could have been the lure. Investigators believe Diego likely walked into the Graf home willingly on the day he disappeared. He wasn't abducted from the street, wasn't dragged away screaming. He went there on his own, trusting that nothing bad could happen at the home of a classmate. But something did happen. And 41 years later, Christian's odd behavior when the remains were uncovered made it impossible to ignore the possibility that he knew exactly what. The press smelled blood. By August 2025, Christian found himself cornered by journalists outside his home. Cameras rolled as one reporter asked him the question directly. "Were you responsible for Diego's death?" Christian froze. For a split second, his face betrayed something: shock, fear, perhaps even guilt. Then he slammed the door shut without answering. No denial. No outrage. Just silence. And in true crime stories, silence often speaks louder than words. That clip went viral. Viewers replayed it again and again, analyzing his flinch, the way his mouth twitched, the way his eyes darted. Some called it the reaction of a guilty man. Others argued it was simply the shock of being accused of murder in front of a camera. But for Diego's family, it was chilling. After decades of not knowing, here was a man living freely, raising his own children, while Diego had never made it past 16. Investigators began digging into Christian's past. His family life seemed stable, a wife, 4 children. He wasn't known for violence. Former classmates described him as quiet, even shy. Nothing about him screamed killer. And yet, the evidence was buried in his own backyard. The remains weren't just close to his family's property, they were literally on the dividing line. The shallow grave sat right next to his mother's house, where Christian had lived at the time of Diego's disappearance. Forensic experts concluded that Diego's body hadn't been dumped by strangers. It had been buried deliberately, quickly, and poorly. Whoever did it had access to the Graff home and the privacy to dig without drawing attention. The finger pointed straight back to Christian. But then came another complication. In August 2025, a former classmate named Adrian Farias came forward with a shocking claim that years earlier in the school bathroom, Diego had attempted to sexually assault him. He described escaping the situation, but admitted he had never spoken of it until now. The revelation added a disturbing wrinkle. If Diego had a reputation among classmates for predatory behavior, could that have sparked a violent confrontation? Could Christian have acted in a moment of rage or revenge? Or was Adrian's testimony a distraction, surfacing only now, decades later, to cloud the picture? Whatever the truth, the timing was critical. Suspicion was already circling Christian like vultures. Now, with new allegations about Diego's behavior, the narrative became murkier. Was Christian a murderer, or a teenager caught in a volatile situation that spiraled into tragedy? The tragedy for investigators is that even if Christian Graff did kill Diego, Argentina's statute of limitations means the crime may be beyond prosecution. 41 years had passed since the murder. Legally, the window for justice had closed. Think about that. The evidence lies in the ground. The DNA confirms the identity. The suspect flinches when asked point-blank if he's guilty. But the law says it might all be meaningless. For Diego's mother, it was a cruel irony. She had waited decades for answers, only to learn that the answers might never bring consequences. And still, the shadow of Christian loomed large. Neighbors began looking at him differently. Some whispered that he had lived a double life, the family man by day, the keeper of a deadly secret by night. Others defended him, insisting he wasn't capable of such violence. But the more people spoke, the more one thing became clear. The secret of Diego's grave had been sitting next door all along. Christian Graff, the boy next door, had grown into a man with a family of his own. Yet suspicion clung to him like a second skin. Every word he spoke, every expression caught on camera, every evasive theory about bones in the dirt, each one painted a darker picture. And as the Fernandez Lima family grappled with the devastating confirmation of Diego's death, the world was left to wonder. Was justice buried right beside him? Or had the killer successfully walked free, hidden in plain sight for more than 4 decades? The suspect next door may never confess. But the silence he left behind speaks volumes. The case had already been twisted by 4 decades of silence. The grave had been found. The DNA had spoken. Suspicion was circling around Christian Graff. But then, like a stone dropped into still water, came a testimony that rippled through everything. A man named Adrian Farias stepped forward. Not just anyone. A former classmate of both Diego Fernandez Lima and Christian Graff. Someone who had walked the same school halls in the 1980s, sat in the same classrooms, worn the same uniforms. Someone who knew both the victim and the suspected killer. And what he revealed shook the investigation to its core. Adrian told prosecutors a story he had never shared before. Not with his friends, not with his parents, not even with classmates. He said that when he was just a teenager in his 2nd year of high school, he had gone into the bathroom alone. And there, Diego Fernandez attacked him. According to Adrian, Diego grabbed him from behind, pants lowered, trying to force himself on him. A sudden, shocking attempted assault. Adrian claimed he fought back, managed to break free and escaped. But he told no one. Not then. Not for decades. What? Because in the 1980s, he explained, no boy dared to admit something like that. The culture was brutal. Homophobia was rampant. To admit you had been the target of such an assault, even if you resisted, meant ridicule, shame, even danger. So he buried the memory. Until now. When Adrian spoke, the room fell silent. Prosecutors listened carefully. The testimony did not come with physical evidence. There were no records, no witnesses, no corroboration. Just his word carried across 40 years of silence. But the implications were heavy. For the public, Diego had always been the innocent boy, snatched from life at 16, robbed of a future. He was mourned, his room preserved, his watch treasured. His mother, Dona Elena, had turned him into a symbol of eternal hope. Now suddenly that image cracked. Was Diego not just a victim, but also an aggressor? The possibility forced people to rethink everything. For investigators, the question was clear. If Adrian's testimony was true, could Diego have assaulted others? Could there have been tension simmering at school? Could someone, perhaps Christian Graff, have known or even been targeted? Was Diego's death an accident born of rage? Or was Adrian's testimony a distraction, a desperate attempt by an old classmate to insert himself into a headline-grabbing case? The ambiguity was suffocating. Adrián described Diego as a joker, someone who liked to push boundaries. He had a way of making jokes, he said. But to him, what happened in that bathroom was no joke. It was an attempted assault. And yet, when asked about Christian Graf, Adrián's description was the complete opposite. Christian, he said, was quiet, low-key, a background figure, not one to draw attention or bully anyone. It was as though Adrián was painting a contrast: Diego, bold and reckless; Christian, subdued and reserved. The subtext was chilling. Was Adrián hinting that maybe Christian snapped? That maybe Diego's behavior, unchecked, led to violence? That Christian, the quiet one, had reached a breaking point in July 1984? The testimony was explosive, but also deeply problematic. Critics asked, why now? Why come forward after 40 years, when Diego couldn't defend himself, when the family was already crushed by the confirmation of his death? Others wondered if Adrián's memory could even be trusted. Memory is fragile. Trauma reshapes recollection. Could what he described have been real, or had it grown, warped over decades in silence, until it became something he believed with all his heart? And then there was the timing. Adrián's testimony emerged just as the spotlight had turned fiercely onto Christian Graf. To some, it looked like an attempt to muddy the waters, to give Christian cover, to recast Diego as someone who provoked his own death. But for others it rang true. They argued that the revelation explained everything: the motive, the violence, the attempt to hide the body. The public fractured. For Diego's family, Adrián's words were salt in a wound that had only just been reopened. Imagine being Diego's mother. For 40 years, you've held on to the memory of your son as a kind, playful boy. You've protected his room, his belongings, his memory. You've defended him from silence and obscurity. And then, the moment his bones are identified, someone steps forward to tarnish his image. How do you process that? Elena refused to engage. To her, Diego was her son, her boy, frozen forever at 16. No testimony could take that away. No accusation could rewrite the years of waiting, the love she had preserved like a flame in the dark. But to the outside world, the narrative was shifting. This is the cruel truth of cold cases. When time drags on, victims become symbols. And symbols are fragile. The moment new testimony surfaces, even unverified, it reshapes how people remember. Diego was now no longer just the innocent boy. He was, in some eyes, a troubled teenager whose actions might have led to his own violent end. And that shift, whether true or not, played straight into the hands of the man under suspicion. Because if Christian Graf had killed Diego, this testimony suggested a possible motive. A clash. A breaking point. The quiet boy snapping against the louder one. The question for investigators was this: did Adrián's testimony bring them closer to the truth, or further away from it? On paper, the case was already crippled by the statute of limitations. But in the court of public opinion, testimony mattered. And now the lines were blurred. Was Diego purely a victim of murder? Was Christian truly the predator hiding in plain sight? Or had a darker, messier story unfolded between two teenagers? One that no one wanted to admit at the time and no one could prove now? For viewers, the story became even harder to digest. What do you do when the perfect victim is called into question? When the lines between innocence and guilt blur, not in the courtroom but in memory, in legacy, in narrative. Diego's skeleton told one truth: he was killed. He was stabbed, possibly dismembered, and buried like refuse. That is fact. But Adrián's testimony added another layer, that before he became a victim, Diego may have been something else entirely. And in that tension, the space between fact and memory, between evidence and testimony, the case slipped deeper into shadows. Because sometimes the most haunting mysteries aren't about what happened, but about who people truly were. And as prosecutors wrestled with this new revelation, the Fernandez Lima family faced an even crueler question. Would Diego be remembered as the boy who never came home, or as something darker, twisted by testimony too late to disprove? The discovery of Diego Fernandez Lima's bones should have been the beginning of justice. Instead, it became the cruelest twist of all. Because just as investigators pieced together the fragments of a life stolen, the law stepped in and slammed the door shut. Not with handcuffs, not with a trial, but with 4 words carved into Argentina's legal code: the statute of limitations. In Argentina, homicide cases carry a statute of limitations of 20 years if no prosecution has been initiated. 20 years. Diego disappeared in 1984. His remains were found in 2025. 41 years had passed. That meant, No matter how compelling the evidence, no matter how damning the suspicion, his killer could not be prosecuted. The crime, legally speaking, was already buried alongside Diego. To the Fernandez Lima family, it was a second burial. For prosecutors, the frustration was visceral. They had the bones. They had forensic evidence, stab wounds, marks of attempted dismemberment. They had objects that spoke of his final moments, the Casio watch, the uniform tie, the clothing fragments. They even had a living suspect, Christian Graf, whose house sat just meters from the grave, who had behaved suspiciously when the workers uncovered the remains, who had dodged questions with nervous half-smiles before slamming the door shut. They had all of this, but no power to bring it to trial. The law was a wall, impenetrable and merciless. For Diego's mother, the news was devastating. Imagine, 41 years of waiting. For decades of tending to her son's untouched bedroom. Of refusing to change the phone number in case he ever called. Of holding on to hope even as her husband died chasing leads that went nowhere. And finally, after all that, the truth surfaces. His body is found. His identity confirmed. The mystery solved. But then comes the blow. There will be no trial. No judge. No jury. No day in court. The killer, if he is alive, if he is known, walks free, shielded not by innocence but by the clock. For Elena it was unbearable. To outlive your child is already a nightmare. To outlive justice itself is worse. The statute of limitations exists, in theory, to protect against the flaws of memory and evidence. The longer a crime goes unsolved, the harder it becomes to build a fair trial. Witnesses die, records vanish, memories fade. But in cases like this, it becomes a weapon. Because the silence wasn't the family's fault. The failure wasn't theirs. It was the system's. Police who dismissed the case in 1984, saying Diego probably ran away with a girlfriend. Authorities who didn't search, didn't investigate, didn't listen. If they had acted then, justice might have been possible. But they didn't. They failed. And now the law turned around and punished the family again for that failure. For the public, it sparked outrage. Newspapers ran headlines like, "Bones speak, but the law stays silent. A crime without consequences. Justice delayed, justice denied." On social media, Argentinians debated fiercely. Some demanded reforms to eliminate statutes of limitation for violent crimes. Others argued the law had to stand, no matter how painful, to preserve fairness in the justice system. But for most, one question burned brightest: how could a child's killer walk free just because too much time had passed? For Diego's younger brother, Javier, it was yet another scar. He had been the last to see Diego alive. He had carried that memory for decades. Now, as a grown man, he watched the truth emerge, only to see the law shrug its shoulders. It was as though the state itself was saying, "Yes, your brother was killed. But no, we will do nothing." A lifetime of silence, followed by silence again. And then there was Christian Graf. The man whose home had hidden Diego's remains for decades. The man who offered bizarre theories to workers when the bones were uncovered. First suggesting they belonged to a priest, then to a stable, then to some unknown stranger. The man who flinched when a journalist asked if he was the killer, slamming his door shut without a denial. Now he was shielded. Not by innocence, not by acquittal, but by a technicality. And that made him more chilling than ever. Because he could walk through the streets of Buenos Aires knowing that even if every neighbor believed he was guilty, no cell would ever close around him. For Elena, Diego's mother, the law's indifference was more brutal than any blade. She had spent 41 years keeping her son's memory alive. Now she faced the reality that even the system tasked with protecting life had abandoned him. When asked how she felt, she spoke softly but firmly, "I have waited all my life for Diego. Now I will wait until I die for justice. And I will never see it." Her words cut deeper than any prosecutor's statement. They revealed the raw wound the law had left behind. That sometimes the cruelty isn't just in the crime, but in the way society responds, or refuses to respond. This chapter of the story is perhaps the most haunting. Because bones can tell us what happened. Science can give us names, times, causes of death. But only the law can punish. Only the law can deliver justice. And when the law refuses, families are left with answers but no closure. It's a special kind of torment, to finally know the truth, but to realize the truth will never matter in a courtroom. And so, Diego's story remains suspended, not just in the past but in a strange, legal limbo. The boy who vanished in 1984 was found in 2025. His killer may be known. His final moments may be reconstructed. But justice? That is a chapter that will never be written. The statute of limitations has locked it away forever. And that, more than anything, is the final cruelty of Diego's case. Because sometimes the deepest injustice isn't that a killer escapes, it's that the law itself insists they must. The law had failed. Justice had slipped away, sealed by a deadline written in cold ink decades earlier. But grief doesn't respect statutes. Mourning doesn't expire. And for the Fernandez Lima family, the discovery of Diego's bones reopened every wound they had carried since July 26, 1984. This chapter isn't about suspects or testimonies. It isn't about forensic reports or legal barriers. It's about a family, broken, waiting, remembering. It's about a vigil that has lasted 4 decades. Diego's mother, Elena, is 87 years old. A small, fragile woman with white hair and tired hands, but eyes that still carry the stubborn fire of a mother who never gave up. For 41 years, she kept Diego's room exactly as he left it. The bed still made. The schoolbook stacked neatly on the desk. Posters on the walls, faded now but untouched. His soccer ball in the corner. His clothes folded in drawers. It was more than a bedroom. It was a shrine. A place frozen in time, waiting for him to walk through the door. Every morning she would pass by and pause. Sometimes she would whisper, "Good morning, Diego." Sometimes she would sit on the edge of his bed and run her hands across the quilt, smoothing it as though he had just risen moments earlier. And every night she would leave the door slightly open, just in case he came home while she was sleeping. Now in 2025, when investigators told her the bones belonged to her son, Elena didn't scream. She didn't collapse. She didn't rage. Instead, she sat in silence, her hands folded in her lap. Because deep down she had always known. Hope had carried her for decades, yes, but behind the hope was certainty. A mother's intuition. The kind that doesn't need science or DNA to recognize the truth. But still, hearing it spoken aloud was like losing him all over again. Her husband never lived to hear that truth. In the years after Diego's disappearance, he had thrown himself into the search. He traveled miles chasing false leads, knocking on doors, questioning anyone who might have seen a boy with dark hair and a bright smile. He searched until exhaustion consumed him. And then, in a cruel twist, he died in an accident while looking for his son. To Elena, his death was part of the same tragedy. She had lost her husband to the search just as surely as she had lost her son to the crime. Now she was the last sentinel left, standing guard over Diego's memory. For Diego's younger brother, Javier, the vigil was different. He had been the last to see Diego alive. He was just a boy himself when Diego left the house that July afternoon, saying he was going to a friend's house and then to school. "I'll see you later," Diego had said. But later never came. For 41 years, Javier replayed that moment, wondering if he could have stopped his brother from leaving, if he should have asked more questions, if there had been some sign he missed. Survivor's guilt. It's a heavy chain, and Javier carried it for decades. And now, as a grown man standing in front of the media, hearing prosecutors say that the bones were Diego's, he felt that weight sink even deeper. The family now faced an impossible choice. How do you mourn a boy who was gone for 41 years but never properly buried? Do you hold a funeral now, after decades of waiting? Do you lay him to rest in a cemetery, or do you keep his remains close, in the home where his memory already lived? How do you invite people to a funeral when his absence had already been mourned in silence for decades? These weren't just logistical questions. They were emotional landmines. Every decision felt like a betrayal, like closing a door that had been left open for too long. And there was another complication, the family's image of Diego. For years, he had been frozen in memory as the perfect son, the innocent boy. Now, with Adrián Farias's testimony suggesting darker sides of his character, whispers had entered the narrative. The family rejected those claims outright. To them, Diego was still Diego, the boy who played soccer, loved motorcycles, and left home with a smile. But whispers have a way of sticking. And for Elena, the idea that her son's memory might be tarnished was as painful as the realization that justice would never be served. She was left to guard not just his room but his reputation. The vigil wasn't just within the family home. Neighbors, classmates, even strangers who had followed the case over the years began leaving flowers near the property line where Diego's bones were discovered. A makeshift memorial grew, a candle here, a photograph there, scraps of paper with handwritten prayers. It was a collective grieving, as if the whole community had been holding its breath since 1984. And now, with the secret unearthed, they exhaled in mourning. But Elena quietly refused to call it closure. "Closure is for people who get justice," she said. "What I have is only truth." And even truth came too late. Her words echoed the sorrow of countless families whose missing children were found too late for justice, too late for answers. Because knowing where Diego's bones lay didn't answer the questions that really mattered. Why had he been killed? Who had wielded the knife? Why had his body been hidden just meters from safety? Those questions remained in the shadows, gnawing at the family's grief. In many ways, the vigil continues. Yes, Diego has been found. Yes, the family can finally mourn him properly. But mourning doesn't erase absence. Mourning doesn't replace the decades of birthdays missed, the milestones never reached, the empty chair at every family gathering. And mourning certainly doesn't erase the bitterness of a justice system that left them abandoned. For Elena, every day is still a vigil. Every morning she still whispers, "Good morning, Diego." Every night she still leaves the door cracked open, even if she knows he will never walk through it again. Because for some mothers, hope doesn't die, even when the truth does. The Fernandez Lima family's vigil is a reminder of what lies at the heart of every cold case. Families, not files. People, not paperwork. Mothers who never stop waiting. Brothers who never stop asking, what if? Fathers who die searching. It's not just about the crime. It's about the silence that follows, and the way that silence reshapes lives across decades. And for this family, that silence has been deafening. The bones have been found. The truth has been told. But the vigil continues. Because until justice is served, even if it never is, Diego Fernandez Lima's family will remain exactly where they've been since July 26, 1984. Waiting. The shovel struck the earth. A hollow sound. And then, the silence. That silence has lingered for 41 years. It is the silence of a boy who never came home. The silence of a father who died searching. The silence of a mother who whispered his name into the void. The silence of a justice system that looked away. This is the story of Diego Fernandez Lima, but it is also the story of what silence does when it stretches across generations. When Diego left home on July 26, 1984, his life ended in violence. But his absence created something else, an echo. An echo in his family's home, his mother moving through rooms that felt emptier every year. An echo in his brother's mind, haunted by the memory of watching Diego leave that afternoon. An echo in a neighborhood that whispered rumors for decades about what might have happened to him. That echo has never stopped. Because silence isn't nothing. Silence is heavy. It shapes lives. It forces people to live in limbo, caught between hope and despair, unable to close the wound, unable to move forward. For the Fernandez Lima family, silence became both an enemy and a companion. And then came May 2025. When workers uncovered the bones half a meter beneath the ground, silence was broken. But it was not replaced by answers. It was replaced by noise, headlines, speculation, testimonies, cameras. For 41 years, Diego had been forgotten by the justice system. Now, suddenly, everyone wanted to speak his name again. Everyone wanted to know the details. But the family quickly realized, noise is not the same as justice. Noise fills the air with chatter. Justice fills it with truth. And truth was still incomplete. Christian Graff, the neighbor, the classmate, the man whose property became the boy's grave, stood at the center of the storm. His evasive answers. His bizarre suggestions to workers about priests and stables. His silence when confronted by journalists. Suspicion swirled around him. But suspicion isn't proof. And even if proof came, Argentina's statute of limitations on homicide had already expired. The system had already decided that time itself was enough to erase accountability. Which means that Diego's voice, silenced in 1984, was silenced again in 2025, this time by the law. The echoes of silence, however, don't only come from the halls of justice. They come from the cracks in memory. Former classmates step forward with testimonies, some painting Diego as a bright boy, others tarnishing his image with accusations. What is truth? What is rumor? 41 years later, memories blur. Testimonies shift. People remember what they want to remember or what benefits them. And so, Diego's story becomes contested even in death. His body is found, but his identity, his character, remains debated. That is another cruelty of silence. The longer it lasts, the more it distorts. For Elena, Diego's mother, silence has been a life sentence. At 87, she is frail but resolute. She still tends to her son's room. She still leaves the phone line unchanged. She still whispers his name into the quiet. But now she whispers differently. Before, she whispered with hope, believing he might hear her, might come back. Now she whispers with finality, knowing he never will. The silence has shifted. It is no longer a waiting silence. It is a mourning silence. And yet, in her own words, she refuses to call it closure. Closure, she says, is for those who get justice. I have only the truth. And even that truth came too late. In this way, Diego's story is bigger than Diego. It represents every family that has waited in vain for answers. Every mother who has left a bedroom untouched. Every father who has died searching. Every sibling who has grown old under the weight of survivor's guilt. It represents the cruelty of systems that measure crimes not in grief but in years, that tell families, too much time has passed, your pain no longer matters in court. And it represents the resilience of memory, the refusal of families to let silence erase their loved ones completely. The echoes of silence spread outward. To journalists who keep asking the questions. To neighbors who now wonder what secrets have always been buried beneath their feet. To a community grappling with the idea that a teenage boy's life was cut short and discarded just meters from where people lived, laughed, and sang songs. Even Gustavo Cerati's name, the rock legend who once lived next door, became entangled in the story, not because he had anything to do with it, but because silence often needs something famous to cling to in order to be heard. The irony is that Diego never got to live long enough to know Soda Stereo's music, or to witness Cerati's rise. His time stopped before theirs even began. And yet, decades later, his grave would be discovered in Cerati's shadow. Life is cruel like that. So where does this story end? With bones in the ground? With DNA matches? With a suspect who may never face trial? No. It ends where it began, in silence. But this silence is different now. It is not the silence of ignorance. It is the silence of knowledge. The silence that comes after screams, when truth has been spoken but justice has not. The Fernandez Lima family will carry that silence forever. So will every viewer who has followed their story. Because once you hear silence this loud, you never forget it. And maybe that is Diego's final legacy. Not as a soccer player. Not as a boy with a Casio watch and a school tie. Not even as a murder victim. But as a reminder of what silence can do. It can break families. It can erase justice. It can distort memory. But it can also echo, across decades, across borders, across stories like this one. And if those echoes reach far enough, maybe they can break through the walls that still keep other families waiting, other names unspoken, other graves undiscovered. The silence around Diego Fernandez Lima lasted 41 years. But as long as his story is told, as long as we speak his name, that silence will not be the final word. Because silence only wins when we stop listening.